Hello, this is the demo of the Dauriel Network, a technology stack for the tokenization of financial assets on the blockchain. We will show the demo from two perspectives. First, the issuer who wants to issue a new asset. Then, the investor who wants to purchase a new asset. The interface you see here is the one the issuer has access to, and more specifically, this is the place where the issuer will be able to create a new asset. The first step is for the issuer to fill in the compliance requirements. Every checkbox you can see here corresponds either to an information or to a document that will be requested from the investor once they go through the asset acquisition process. Every ticked checkbox will be reflected in the KYC form the investor will have to submit. The second step is to choose a name for the asset. For example, WIN token, and a symbol. Once completed, the new asset can be created. A new ERC 1400 asset smart contract is currently being deployed on a private blockchain network. That's it. The asset is created, and we can see it here at the bottom of the page. On top of it, we have another asset that has been deployed earlier. It already contains a list of investors, and we can see the number of assets they own on the left column. But let's focus on the WIN token we've just created. Before going through the whole issuance process, let's have a look directly at the blockchain through this Blockchain Explorer. The transactions appear on the right. We can see that the last transaction is a new contract deployment. This corresponds to the asset we've just created. For information, the blockchain we use is a private Ethereum blockchain with proof of authority ConsenSys that ensures us higher scalability, increased privacy, and transaction finality compared to public networks. Returning back to the issuer interface, we will now start the asset issuance process by inviting a new investor. After indicating their email address and the amount of titles they will be allowed to purchase, we can send the investor an invitation. This will start the asset acquisition process for the investor. During this process, the investor will need to go through these important steps. Fill in a KYC form. Send a bank deposit. That's it. The investor has been created and invited by email. We can see the investor's status is invited, which means that the investor is in the first step of the asset acquisition process. We'll now change places and switch to the investor interface. This is the investor's mailbox. We can see they have just received a new email. The email invites the investor to acquire the freshly created WIN tokens. The first step is for the investor to register on the platform. There is a Google authentication to sign up on the platform. This leads to a short description of the asset the investor is about to purchase. Let's start investing. The first step is to fill a KYC form by providing the information requested by the issuer during the asset creation. For the purpose of the demo, everything here is already pre-filled. We can upload the necessary documents, such as proof of registration or a tax report, etc. Once finished, the KYC form can be sent to the issuer. That's all for now. Back to the mailbox, the investor has received a confirmation email. It tells us the issuer has received our response and will require some time in order to validate the uploaded KYC elements. The investor will only be allowed to continue the asset acquisition process once all the elements provided have been verified. Let's go back to the issuer interface and see what has changed. By scrolling down to our KYC investor, we can see the investor is now in a new stage, Step 2, KYC submitted. This means the issuer can now validate the KYC. Let's assume The provided KYC elements are correct, and the issuer decides to validate the investor. We now go back to the investor interface, where we find a new email. The investor is informed that the KYC has indeed been validated, and the investor is invited to access and sign the asset acquisition contract. We go back on the platform and find the contract. After reading it attentively and being satisfied, the investor decides to sign the contract. This is a key step of the demo, as by signing the contract, the investor will reserve the assets on the blockchain. Multiple actions are being executed in the background here. First, the application will check if the investor has already validated the KYC. Second, if this is the case, the investor will be provided with a certificate. Third, the certificate will be inserted inside the transaction and sent to the blockchain network. Since we use an evolved token standard, the ERC 1400, it is ensured that no transaction can be accepted without this certificate. This empowers the issuer with strong control over issued assets, including on the secondary market. Let's do it and sign the contract. We can see that everything happens in the background and remains invisible to the investor. Let's go back to the issuer interface. Since the investor has signed the contract, the tokens have appeared and they belong to the reserved partition. A partition is a property of the ERC 1400, which defines a state for the token. In this case, reserved means the tokens exist, but they cannot be used by the investor yet. Why? Because the investor still needs to complete the final step of the acquisition process, the transfer of funds to the issuer's bank account. Completing this last step will update the partition of the token from reserved to issued. Let's now go back to the investor interface to finalize this process. The investor has received a new email which tells them the WIN tokens have been successfully reserved on the blockchain. The investor is now expected to transfer the funds to the issuer's bank account in order to finalize the process. The investor will be able to find the issuer's bank account information at the bottom of the email. Let's assume the investor transfers the funds smoothly, and we are now back on the issuer interface. We confirm the deposit funds have been received. The investor status switches to verified, which means the investor has completed the entire asset acquisition process. This issuer's final action triggered a blockchain transaction to update the state of the tokens. As expected, the tokens have now switched from partition reserved to issued, which means the investor successfully owns the assets. The investor is now allowed to use the assets and can transfer them on the secondary market if desired. If we have a final look at the blockchain, we can see the transaction validated a few seconds ago. And if we go back to the investor's mailbox, we see that we can now use our WIN tokens since they have been released.